December 1944. Outside Bastogne, the snow came in sheets and the mortars wouldn't elevate high enough. Sergeant Julian Hendrickx stood in a frozen meadow, watching his crew struggle with a problem that shouldn't have existed. The 81-meter mortar had been designed to lob shells in a high arc, but the German position sat on a ridgeline 2 miles away. Standard elevation gave them nothing. The shells fell short every time, and the Germans kept firing. Hendrickx was a Kansas farmhand before the war. 29 years old, no engineering degree, no artillery school, just 8 months in North Africa, 4 in Italy, and now this. The Ardennes in winter surrounded them, supplies cut and a weapon that couldn't reach the enemy. He looked at the mortar tube, then at the base plate, then at the bipod legs that held the assembly upright. And he thought about fence posts. The Ardennes offensive had begun 5 days earlier, December 16, 1944. 3 German armies smashing westward through fog and forest, targeting the weakest section of the Allied line. 28 divisions, 200,000 men, the largest German offensive since 1940. Hitler had gambled everything on splitting the Allied front, driving to Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace before the Soviets reached Berlin. The attack caught the Americans by surprise. Eisenhower had thinned this sector deliberately, concentrating forces farther north for the drive into Germany. Only 4 divisions held an 80-mile front. When the Germans struck, they punched through in hours. Entire regiments were surrounded. Communications collapsed. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers. The 101st Airborne had been resting near Reims, rebuilt after Operation Market Garden. Fresh replacements, new equipment. They were supposed to have another week before returning to combat. Instead, they received orders on December 17th. Move to Bastogne immediately, hold the road junction, stop the German advance. They loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night. No winter gear, no cold weather training. Most men still wore the same uniforms they jumped in over Normandy. They reached Bastogne on December 19th, just hours before German forces closed the ring. Hendrickx and his mortar section arrived with them. They dug in on the eastern perimeter. They waited, and when the enemy reached the high ground east of town, the American mortars found themselves outranged by geography. Mortars are not guns. They don't fire flat. They fire up, relying on gravity to bring the shell down on target. The standard M1 81mm mortar had a maximum elevation of 85 degrees, nearly straight up. It could hurl a 10-pound shell almost 3,000 yards if you angled it correctly, but angle is everything. And in December 1944, outside Bastogne, the angle was wrong. The German position sat at 1,100 feet. The American line sat at 900. That 200-foot difference changed the geometry. Shells fired at maximum elevation arced beautifully into the sky and fell into the valley between. They never reached the ridge. Physics doesn't negotiate. Hendrickx had 7 men in his squad: Private First Class Robert Morrison from Ohio, Corporal James Wheeler from Georgia, Private Eugene DeColai from New Jersey, Private Thomas Reeves from Alabama, Private Harold Chen from California, Private Leonard Kowalski from Michigan, and Private Daniel Shaw from Maine, average age 22. They'd been together since training at Fort Benning. They'd fought through Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio before transferring to the Airborne. They trusted each other. They trusted Hendrickx. They'd fired 19 shells that morning, 19 failures. The company commander wanted suppressive fire on the German mortars. He wanted it now. The Germans had already knocked out 2 American machine gun nests and a forward observation post. They were walking their fire closer to the main line. Time mattered. Standard doctrine said mortars couldn't solve this problem. Standard doctrine said, bring up the howitzers. But the howitzers were stuck 3 miles west, axle deep in mud and snow. The roads were cratered. The trucks couldn't move, and the Germans owned the high ground. Hendrickx thought about elevation. He thought about the angle of the tube. And he thought about what happens when you change the fulcrum. His father had been a tenant farmer, worked other people's land for 30 years before saving enough to buy 40 acres outside Salina. The land was uneven, rolling hills and rocky soil. Fence posts had to be set at different depths to keep the wire level. Young Julian learned early that you don't fight the terrain, you adapt to it. A post on a slope gets set deeper on the uphill side. A gate on uneven ground gets shimmed with rocks or wood scraps. You make it work. That's what Hendrickx thought about, standing in the snow outside Bastogne, watching his mortars fail. Mortars rest on base plates, heavy steel circles that anchor the weapon and absorb recoil. The M1 mortar base plate weighed 45 pounds, 14 inches in diameter, cast iron. A socket welded to the center held the mortar tube. The plate sat flat on the ground. The tube sat in the socket. The bipod legs extended forward, adjustable for elevation. Standard setup. Standard geometry. Standard limitations. The bipod could adjust the tube from 45 to 85 degrees. That range worked for normal conditions. Flat terrain, similar elevations, targets within 3,000 yards. But the geometry assumed the base plate remained level. Tilt the plate and everything changed. Hendrickx walked to the supply dump and found 2 empty oil barrels, 55-gallon drums, steel, dented, crusted with ice. Standard issue for fuel transport. Each weighed about 60 pounds empty. He dragged them back to the mortar position and told his crew to pull the base plate. They stared at him. Wheeler said, "Sarge, we can't fire without the plate." Hendrickx said, "We're not getting rid of it. We're tilting it." He explained his thinking. The plate sits flat. The tube points too high. The shells fall short, but if you tilt the plate forward, the tube tilts with it. Lower angle, flatter trajectory, more range. Morrison said, "That'll put all the recoil stress sideways. The plate could crack." Hendrickx said, "Could the Germans keep dropping shells on our heads?" "Pick one." They picked. The crew pulled the base plate, tipped it back, and shoved the 2 barrels crosswise beneath the rear edge. The plate now rested at a forward angle, maybe 15 degrees. The tube, still socketed into the plate, angled forward with it. The bipod legs extended at their lowest setting, and suddenly the geometry changed. The tube no longer pointed nearly vertical. It pointed up and out, more like a howitzer than a mortar. Hendrickx estimated 40 degrees, maybe less. He didn't have a protractor. He didn't have a manual. He had 2 barrels and a theory about angles. He told his crew to load. Decollai dropped a shell down the tube. The firing pin struck. The propellant ignited. The shell launched with the same familiar thump, but the trajectory was different. Flatter. Faster. The shell arced lower and traveled farther, crossing the valley and slamming into the base of the ridge 500 yards beyond their previous maximum. Still short, but closer. Hendrickx told them to add another barrel. They stacked a 3rd drum under the base plate, tilting it steeper. The tube angled even farther forward. Reeves loaded. Wheeler adjusted the bipod. Shaw checked the alignment. They fired again. The shell flew straight and true, clearing the valley and detonating on the ridgeline where the German mortar sat. Direct hit. Hendrickx had just turned an 81mm mortar into a field gun. The principle was simple. Mortars depend on high-angle fire because their tubes are short, and their propellant charges are fixed. You can't add more powder. You can't change the muzzle velocity. All you can adjust is the angle. Standard doctrine keeps that angle steep to maximize range through a high arc. But Hendrickx realized that if you lowered the angle, you traded arc for distance. The shell wouldn't climb as high, but it would travel farther forward. And if you lowered the angle enough, the mortar stopped behaving like a mortar and started behaving like a cannon. The cross-barrel trick worked because it changed the base geometry without modifying the weapon itself. The mortar tube remained intact. The base plate remained functional. The bipod still provided stability, but by tilting the entire assembly forward on a makeshift fulcrum, Hendrickx effectively reduced the elevation angle by 20 to 30 degrees. That shift transformed the trajectory from a steep plunging arc into a flatter, more direct path. The physics are unforgiving. Shell flight depends on launch angle, muzzle velocity, and gravity. The M1 81mm mortar fired its shell at roughly 700 feet per second, at 85 degrees. That velocity translated into maximum altitude with minimal forward distance. At 40 degrees, the same velocity translated into less altitude, but significantly more forward reach. The shell spent less time climbing and more time traveling horizontally. Range increased by nearly 40%. The shell itself remained unchanged. The M43A1 high-explosive round weighed 10 pounds, 4.8 inches in diameter, stabilized by fins, not spin, filled with 1.3 pounds of TNT. Effective casualty radius 35 yards. The round was designed for indirect fire against infantry, light vehicles, and field fortifications. It wasn't designed for direct fire engagements, but it worked. The improvisation had risks. Mortars are not designed for low-angle fire. The base plate absorbs recoil vertically, not laterally. Firing at reduced elevation put lateral stress on the assembly. The barrels could shift. The plate could crack. The tube could jump loose. And if the crew misjudged the angle, the shell could strike the ground prematurely or skip unpredictably. Hendrickx understood the risks. He fired anyway. Over the next 4 hours, his section launched 63 shells at the German positions. They adjusted the barrel stack between shots, adding or removing drums to fine-tune the angle. 3 barrels gave them maximum range. 2 barrels gave them medium. 1 barrel gave them incremental adjustment. They experimented. They learned. They adapted. They hit mortar pits, machine gun nests, and an ammunition cache. The Germans tried to adjust their fire, but Hendrickx kept moving his position, dragging the barrels and base plate from one spot to another, firing 3 or 4 rounds, then relocating. The Germans couldn't fix his location. They couldn't suppress him, and they couldn't figure out how an American mortar was suddenly outranging their own. The German mortars on the ridge were 81mm Granatwerfer 34s, comparable to the American M1. Similar range, similar shell weight, but the Germans had the high ground advantage. Their mortars didn't need modification to reach the American lines. Gravity worked for them. They could fire at standard elevations and still hit their targets. Hendrickx's improvisation leveled that advantage. By lowering his firing angle, he compensated for the elevation difference. His shells flew farther forward, climbing less but covering more horizontal distance. The Germans lost their geographic edge. By mid-afternoon, German fire from the ridge had noticeably decreased. American infantry reported seeing enemy crews abandoning their positions. Whether Hendrickx's shells caused casualties or simply forced the Germans to relocate wasn't clear. Either way, the pressure eased. By nightfall, the German fire had slackened. The 101st held the line, and Hendrickx was out of shells. Word of the improvisation spread quickly. By December 20th, battalion headquarters sent a lieutenant to interview Hendrickx and sketch the setup. Lieutenant Michael Patterson from Iowa, 24 years old, pre-war engineering student. He spent 2 hours measuring the barrel arrangement, calculating angles, and questioning Hendrickx about the technique. Patterson's notes survive in the National Archives, written in pencil on damp field paper. Sketches showing the base plate tilted on cylindrical objects. Measurements approximately 15 degrees tilt, 3 55-gallon drums, base plate angled forward. Observations increased lateral recoil stress. Base plate showed minor deformation after 60 rounds. Tube showed no visible damage. Bipod remained stable. Technique effective but requires stable ground and careful angle adjustment. Patterson recommended the technique for field use in emergency situations. He also recommended against adopting it as standard practice. The risks to equipment and crew, he wrote, outweighed the benefits except when no alternatives existed. By December 22nd, 3 other mortar sections in the division were experimenting with the technique. Not all attempts succeeded. One crew used wooden crates instead of barrels, and the crates collapsed after 2 shots. Another crew angled the tube too steeply and cracked the base plate. A third crew achieved results similar to Hendrickx, firing 41 shells at extended range before their tube developed stress fractures. But the principle held. Under the right conditions, with the right materials, a standard infantry mortar could be converted into a makeshift field gun. The technique had limitations. Accuracy suffered. Mortars lack rifling, so their shells don't spin in flight. That makes them inherently less precise than howitzer rounds. Standard mortar fire compensated with observer corrections and bracketing fire. You fired a round, observed where it landed, adjusted, and fired again. At high angles, this worked. At low angles, it became harder. Shells fired at reduced elevation traveled faster. They spent less time in flight. That gave observers less time to track them. Impact points became harder to predict. Windage affected flat trajectories more than steep ones. A 5-mile-per-hour crosswind barely moved a shell at 85 degrees. The same wind could push a 40-degree shell 15 yards off target. Hendrickx compensated by firing multiple rounds and walking the impacts onto target. He'd fire, observe, adjust the barrel stack slightly, and fire again. It worked, but it consumed ammunition. His 63 shells achieved results that might have required 30 under standard conditions. Efficiency dropped, but effectiveness remained. The technique also required stable ground. Soft earth or mud would let the barrel sink under recoil. changing the angle unpredictably. Snow was manageable if frozen. Wet snow was not. Hendrickx had the advantage of frozen ground in December. The temperature held below 20 degrees Fahrenheit for the entire siege. The earth was solid. The barrels didn't shift. Other crews in milder conditions found the method unworkable. In January, a mortar section in the Vosges Mountains tried the technique on thawed ground. The barrel sank 3 inches after the first shot. The base plate tilted unevenly. The second shot went wildly off target. They abandoned the attempt, and the technique put stress on the weapon. After 90 rounds, Hendrickx's mortar tube showed hairline cracks near the base. The base plate had deformed slightly, the socket no longer perfectly perpendicular. The weapon remained functional, but the damage was cumulative. Field armorers estimated the tube had lost 20% of its service life. In peacetime, the weapon would have been condemned. In combat, it kept firing. None of that mattered to the men in Bastogne. The siege lasted until December 26th. 10 days of encirclement, constant shelling, and close quarters fighting in frozen forests. The 101st held. Patton's Third Army broke through from the south. The Germans withdrew, and Hendrickx survived. He never wrote a report. The lieutenant's sketch reached division headquarters, but no formal documentation followed. The technique was filed as a field expedient, effective but not recommended. The Army didn't update its mortar manuals. No training films were produced. No doctrine changed. But soldiers talk, and soldiers remember. By January 1945, mortar crews across the European theater knew about the cross-barrel trick. Some tried it, some didn't. The technique worked best in situations where howitzers were unavailable and enemy positions sat beyond standard mortar range. Those situations were common in the Ardennes, less common elsewhere. As Allied forces pushed into Germany, artillery became more plentiful. Roads improved, supply lines shortened, the need for improvised solutions decreased. By March, the technique had largely faded from use. A few mortar sections in isolated positions continued experimenting. A crew in the Hürtgen forest used the method to suppress German bunkers on a hillside. A crew near Remagen used it to extend their range during the bridge crossing, but these were exceptions. Most crews returned to standard methods once circumstances allowed. Hendrickx returned to Kansas in November 1945. He farmed wheat and corn for 32 years, bought 80 additional acres in 1953, raised 2 daughters, coached youth baseball, served on the local school board. He didn't talk much about the war. When asked, he described the cold and the snow. He mentioned Bastogne. He rarely mentioned the mortars. His wife Mary said he had nightmares for years. He'd wake up convinced he was still in Belgium. She said he never talked about what he'd seen, but she knew it stayed with him. She said he worked harder than any man she knew, as if staying busy kept the memories at bay. In 1978, a military historian, researching improvised tactics in World War II, found the lieutenant's sketch in the National Archives. Dr. Alan Friedman from MIT, specialist in field engineering and adaptive combat techniques, was compiling a study on non-doctrinal innovations during the war. The sketch showed a mortar base plate tilted on cylindrical objects labeled barrels or similar. The accompanying note read, Sergeant Hendrickx, 81mm section, achieved extended range by altering base angle. Effective but not authorized. Friedman tracked down Hendrickx and interviewed him by phone. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. Hendrickx confirmed the details. He estimated the angle at 40 degrees. He said the barrels were empty oil drums. He said the idea came from adjusting fence posts on uneven ground. He said it worked until they ran out of shells. Friedman asked if anyone had ever recognized the innovation officially. Hendrickx said no. Friedman asked if he'd received any commendation. Hendrickx said he'd received a Bronze Star for actions during the siege, but nothing specific to the mortar technique. Friedman asked if he thought the Army should have adopted the method. Hendrickx said he didn't know. He said it worked for him in one situation. He couldn't say if it would work everywhere. The interview was published in a Journal of Military History in 1979. Circulation, 1,200 subscribers. No major media picked it up. The story remained obscure, but the principle modern mortar design has evolved significantly since 1944. The current M252 81mm mortar, used by the U.S. military, includes a more versatile base plate and an extended elevation range. Engineers studied field reports from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. They identified recurring problems, range limitations on uneven terrain, the need for lower-angle fire in mountainous environments, and the desire for direct fire capability in urban settings. The M252 can fire at angles as low as 45 degrees without modification. The base plate is reinforced to handle lateral recoil. The bipod includes a traversing mechanism for fine adjustments. The weapon weighs 90 pounds complete, 20 pounds more than the M1, but offers significantly more flexibility. And while no official Army document credits Hendrickx, the design philosophy reflects lessons learned from improvised tactics in the field. The crossed barrel trick itself is no longer necessary. Modern mortars don't need it, but the idea behind it, the willingness to adapt a weapon beyond its intended role, remains central to military thinking. Soldiers improvise because circumstances demand it. Engineers respond because improvisation reveals gaps in design. Numbers tell the story differently. In December 1944, the 101st Airborne fired approximately 11,000 mortar shells during the siege of Bastogne. Hendrick's section accounted for 97 of them, including the initial 19 failures, less than 1%. But those shells fired at unconventional angles suppressed German fire at a critical moment. They allowed American infantry to reposition. They reduced casualties during a vulnerable phase of the defense. The broader impact is harder to measure. How many other crews use the technique? Division records are incomplete. After-action reports mention modified mortar fire in 3 separate incidents but don't specify methods. Post-war interviews with veterans yield anecdotal accounts but few specifics. One estimate suggests 20 to 30 crews across 3 divisions experimented with the technique during the Ardennes campaign. Total shells fired, perhaps 3,000 to 5,000. Total impact unknown. What remains is the image. A Kansas farmhand standing in the snow, staring at a weapon that won't do what he needs, and thinking about fence posts, thinking about angles, thinking about fulcrums and leverage and the stubborn geometry of war. He doesn't have the right tool, so he changes the tool. The mortars weren't designed for it. The manuals didn't authorize it. The doctrine didn't cover it. But the Germans were on the ridge and the shells were falling short, and someone had to solve the problem. Hendrickx solved it with 3 oil barrels and a willingness to break the rules. That willingness matters more than the technical details. War is not a controlled environment. Weapons malfunction. Supply lines fail. Terrain doesn't cooperate. The enemy doesn't behave as predicted. And soldiers, the ones actually fighting, have to adapt. They have to look at what they have, not what they wish they had, and make it work. Hendrickx made it work. He didn't invent a new weapon. He didn't revolutionize tactics. He took an 81mm mortar and tilted it forward on a pile of barrels. And for 4 hours on a frozen afternoon in December 1944, that was enough. The broader legacy of improvised tactics in World War II is well documented. Soldiers welded armor plates onto jeeps, creating ad hoc armored cars. They modified bazookas to fire from buildings, compensating for backblast in confined spaces. They rigged flamethrowers to clear bunkers that grenades couldn't reach. They used Bangalore torpedoes as makeshift bridges. They turned mess kits into entrenching tools. They improvised constantly, adapting to circumstances that training never covered. The cross-barrel trick fits into that tradition. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't safe. It wasn't approved. But it worked when nothing else would. The German forces at Bastogne never knew why the American mortar fire suddenly intensified. They didn't capture Hendrick's position. They didn't recover the barrels. After the siege lifted, the barrels were left behind, anonymous steel drums half buried in snow. No one marked the spot. No one preserved the equipment. The technique passed into memory, carried forward by the men who saw it, tried it, or heard about it later. Hendrickx himself never claimed credit. He didn't seek recognition. When Friedman called in 1978, Hendrickx said he'd just been trying to keep his crew alive. He said the Germans had the high ground and the Americans needed to hit back. He said the barrels were there, so he used them. He said any sergeant would have done the same. That pragmatism defines the story. There was no dramatic revelation, no moment of inspired genius, just a sergeant looking at a problem, considering the tools available, and choosing an unorthodox solution because orthodox methods had failed. The mortar fired. The shells reached the ridge. The Germans pulled back and the line held. That's the outcome. That's the result of one man's refusal to accept that his weapon couldn't do what the situation required. The story endures not because it's extraordinary, but because it's representative. Every war produces 1,000 variations of the same improvisation. Soldiers modify, adapt, and repurpose. They find ways to make inadequate tools adequate. And occasionally they discover something that changes how the tools are designed going forward. Hendrickx didn't change the war. He didn't change the outcome at Bastogne. The 101st would have held regardless. Patton would have arrived. The Germans would have withdrawn. The strategic picture was already set. The Allied advance would continue. Berlin would fall. The war in Europe would end in May. But for 7 men in a frozen field, the crossed barrel trick meant they could fight back. They weren't helpless. They weren't pinned. They had a way to reach the enemy, and that mattered. Not in grand strategic terms, not in the history books, but in the immediate, tangible reality of survival. That's the scale that matters. Not the war, not the battle. The moment, the single problem that needs solving right now with the materials at hand before the next shell lands. Hendrickx solved his problem, and in doing so, he added one small thread to the vast chaotic tapestry of improvisation that defines ground combat. The snow kept falling. The war ground on. Hendrickx and his crew packed up the mortar, left the barrels behind, and moved to the next position. They didn't know they'd done anything noteworthy. They'd just done their job using whatever worked. Decades later, researchers would find the sketch. Historians would note the innovation. Engineers would study the principle, and the story would surface briefly in a journal read by specialists and students. Most people never heard of Julian Hendrickx. Most people never heard of the crossed barrel trick. And that's appropriate. War is not built on famous innovations. It's built on countless small adaptations, most of them forgotten, all of them necessary. Hendrickx returned to Kansas. He farmed. He lived 74 years. He died in 1989, survived by 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. His obituary appeared in the Salina Journal, 147 words. It mentioned his service at Bastogne. It didn't mention the mortars. It said he was a good neighbor, a hard worker, a man who helped others. His funeral drew 83 people. Veterans from the local VFW post served as pallbearers. The pastor spoke about duty and sacrifice. Mary Hendrickx accepted a folded flag, and Julian Hendrickx was buried in Gypsum Hill Cemetery under a standard military marker. But the principle survives, the willingness to improvise. The refusal to accept that a tool can only be used one way. The understanding that doctrine is a guide, not a cage. That understanding saved lives in December 1944. It continues to inform training, design, and tactics today. Not because Hendrickx was a genius, because he was practical, because he looked at his problem and thought about fence posts, and because sometimes the simplest ideas are the ones that matter.